I work as a medical billing specialist at a mid-sized clinic, which basically means I sit in a windowless office for 8 hours a day dealing with insurance claims and patient files. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and lets me work alone most of the time, which I actually prefer. The thing about medical billing is that you see a lot of personal information. Not just names and addresses, but diagnoses, treatment histories, family medical records. After 3 years doing this job, I thought I'd seen everything. Cancer diagnoses in 20-year-olds, domestic violence injuries coded as accidents, addiction cases that span entire families. You develop a thick skin pretty quickly, or at least I thought I had. It started about 6 months ago with a patient file that came across my desk. The name was Jennifer Walsh, and she was listed as a 34-year-old female seeking treatment for chronic fatigue and unexplained weight loss. Nothing unusual there. Doctors see dozens of cases like this every week. What caught my attention was the billing address. It was the same street I lived on, just 4 houses down from my apartment. Small world, I figured. In a town of 40,000 people, you're bound to run into neighbors eventually. I processed her claim like any other and moved on with my day. But something about the case stuck with me, maybe because she lived so close. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying attention when I walked past her house. It was a small blue ranch with white trim, well-maintained but nothing special. I never saw anyone coming or going, which wasn't particularly strange. Most people work during the day, and I usually walked to my car in the early morning and came home after 6. The second time Jennifer Walsh's file crossed my desk was 3 weeks later. This time, the diagnosis was different. Severe anemia and what the doctor noted as suspicious bruising patterns. The treating physician had ordered a full blood panel and requested photos of the injuries for the file. As someone who processes medical claims, I don't usually see the actual medical photos, just the billing codes. But this file was flagged for review because the insurance company was questioning whether the injuries were related to a pre-existing condition or a separate incident. I opened the photo attachment and immediately felt sick. Jennifer Walsh had bruises covering her arms, neck, and face. These weren't the kind of bruises you get from bumping into furniture. They were finger-shaped marks around her throat, defensive wounds on her forearms, and what looked like boot prints on her ribs. The photos were taken in a clinical setting, probably at the hospital, and you could see how scared she looked even though she was trying to smile for the camera. The worst part was the date stamp. The photos were taken on a Tuesday morning at 3:47 a.m. I knew that time stamp because I remembered that night clearly. I'd been up late dealing with insomnia, standing by my kitchen window drinking tea around 3:30 a.m. when I heard what sounded like a woman screaming from somewhere on my street. It only lasted a few seconds, and by the time I got to the front window to look out, everything was quiet. I convinced myself it was probably a TV or maybe cats fighting. Living alone makes you paranoid about every sound, so I'd gotten used to dismissing things. Now I knew it wasn't cats. It was Jennifer Walsh, and she lived 4 houses down from me. While I was standing in my kitchen second-guessing what I heard, she was getting beaten so badly that she ended up in the emergency room. The guilt hit me like a physical weight. If I'd called the police when I first heard the scream, maybe they could have stopped it. Maybe she wouldn't have spent hours in the hospital getting photographed for evidence. I couldn't concentrate on work for the rest of the day. Every file I processed felt meaningless compared to the knowledge that I'd failed someone who lived on my own street. When I got home that evening, I found myself staring at her house longer than usual. The blue paint looked darker somehow, and I noticed that all the curtains were drawn shut. There was a car in the driveway that I'd never seen before, a black pickup truck with tinted windows and some kind of sports decal on the back windshield. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos. The finger marks around her throat were so clear that I could almost make out individual fingerprints. I kept thinking about how terrified she must have been, how long the attack must have lasted for her to sustain that many injuries. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and made some coffee. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, trying to distract myself with work emails, when I heard a car door slam outside. I looked out the window and saw someone walking away from the black pickup truck in Jennifer's driveway. It was too dark to see details, but the person was tall and walked with a heavy step that I could hear even through my closed windows. They went into the house, and a few minutes later, I saw lights turning on and off in different rooms. It struck me as strange because it was the middle of the night and the lights seemed to be moving in a pattern, like someone was systematically going through each room. The next morning, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't live with myself knowing what I knew and doing nothing about it. During my lunch break, I called the non-emergency police line and explained that I was concerned about a neighbor who might be in an abusive situation. I didn't mention the medical files, obviously, because that would violate patient privacy laws and probably cost me my job. I just said I'd heard screaming a few weeks ago and was worried. The officer I spoke to was polite, but not particularly encouraging. He said they couldn't investigate based on a weeks-old noise complaint, especially since no one had called it in at the time. He suggested I could call if I heard anything concerning in the future, but there wasn't much they could do with the information I was giving them. I understood his position, but it was frustrating to feel so powerless. 3 days later, Jennifer Walsh's file came across my desk for the third time. This time, the visit was for what the doctor coded as accidental injuries: a broken wrist, multiple contusions, and a concussion. The notes indicated she'd fallen down the stairs at home. But there was also a social worker consultation note attached, which meant someone at the hospital was asking the right questions. The social worker had documented concerns about the pattern of injuries and noted that the patient seemed fearful and reluctant to discuss how the accidents occurred. That weekend, I made a decision that I'm still not sure was the right one. I wrote an anonymous letter detailing what I'd observed about the late-night activity at Jennifer's house, the black pickup truck, and my concern that someone was being hurt. I didn't mention the medical files, just what I'd seen and heard as a neighbor. I mailed it to the police station, addressed to the domestic violence unit. I never found out if the letter made any difference. For the next month, life on my street seemed normal. I saw the black pickup truck come and go at various times, always driven by someone I couldn't quite see clearly. Jennifer's house remained buttoned up with all the curtains closed, but that wasn't necessarily unusual. Some people just value their privacy. Then, one Thursday morning in October, I woke up to police cars and an ambulance on my street. They were parked in front of Jennifer's house, and there was yellow tape across the front yard. I could see neighbors standing in small groups, talking quietly and pointing. My stomach dropped because I immediately knew it had to be related to whatever had been happening to Jennifer. I got dressed quickly and walked outside, trying to look like I was just heading to work early. One of my neighbors, an older man named Frank, who lived across the street, approached me. He told me that Jennifer Walsh had been found dead in her home early that morning. The police weren't saying much, but Frank had heard from someone else that it looked suspicious. There had been signs of a struggle, and they were treating it as a homicide investigation. I felt like I was going to throw up right there on the sidewalk. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of, exactly why I'd tried to get help. I'd known something terrible was happening. I'd seen the evidence of escalating violence in those medical files, and somehow it still wasn't enough to save her. The anonymous letter, the phone call to police, my hypervigilance about her house, none of it had mattered. The investigation lasted for weeks. Police officers canvassed the neighborhood multiple times, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. Each time they knocked on my door, I told them the same thing, that I'd heard screaming a few weeks ago, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. I didn't mention the medical files, the photos, or the pattern of injuries I'd seen documented. That information was protected by privacy laws, and revealing it would have destroyed my career and possibly compromised the investigation. It was torture. Knowing I had pieces of the puzzle that might help catch whoever killed Jennifer, but being legally unable to share them. Medical records are only accessible to law enforcement through proper warrants and court orders. If I'd volunteered that information, it would have been inadmissible in court and would have cost me my job and probably resulted in criminal charges against me. About 6 weeks after Jennifer's death, they arrested her ex-boyfriend, Marcus Torres. It turned out he'd been stalking her for months after she'd gotten a restraining order. The black pickup truck was registered to him, and neighbors in other areas had seen him parked outside her workplace and following her to the grocery store. The case made local news, and the details that came out during the trial were even worse than I'd imagined. Jennifer had been trying to leave Marcus for over a year. She'd moved to a new address, changed jobs, and even considered leaving town entirely. But Marcus always found ways to track her down. The injuries I'd seen in her medical files were just the ones severe enough to require hospital treatment. According to testimony from her sister, Jennifer had been covering up minor injuries for months, making excuses about being clumsy or accident-prone. The night she was killed, Marcus had broken into her house while she was sleeping. The medical examiner testified that she'd fought back, which explained some of the defensive wounds, but Marcus was significantly larger and stronger. She'd managed to call 911 during the attack, but the call was cut short, and by the time police arrived, she was already dead. Marcus was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The case was closed, justice was served, and everyone moved on with their lives. Except I couldn't move on. I was stuck replaying that night when I'd heard the screaming, wondering what would have happened if I'd immediately called 911 instead of convincing myself it was nothing. Would those extra minutes have made a difference? Would Jennifer still be alive? I started having panic attacks at work whenever domestic violence cases crossed my desk. Medical billing involves seeing the aftermath of violence, regularly broken bones from assaults, injuries from child abuse, evidence of elder neglect. Cases I'd processed without a second thought before Jennifer's death now made me physically ill. I'd see bruising patterns or suspicious injury descriptions and immediately think about who wasn't getting help, whose cries for help I might be missing. My supervisor noticed my declining performance and suggested I take some time off. I used up all my vacation days and sick leave, but the break didn't help. Every time I tried to return to work, I'd panic at the thought of missing another Jennifer Walsh, of having information that could save someone's life, but being powerless to act on it. I eventually had to quit my job. The legal restrictions that protect patient privacy exist for important reasons, but they created an impossible situation for me. I couldn't live with processing evidence of ongoing abuse and being unable to report it. The knowledge that I might see patterns of escalating violence in medical records, but be forbidden from warning anyone, was overwhelming. These days, I work in retail management, a job that has nothing to do with confidential information or life or death situations. It pays less than medical billing, and I had to move to a smaller apartment, but my mental health is slowly improving. I don't wake up in the middle of the night anymore wondering whose screams I'm ignoring. I don't spend my days processing evidence of violence that I can't report, but I still drive past Jennifer's house, sometimes when I'm in the old neighborhood. The new owners painted it yellow and put in a flower garden. It looks cheerful now, like a place where happy families live. Most people probably don't even know what happened there. The story was in the news for a few weeks. Then everyone moved on to other tragedies. I'll never know if I could have saved Jennifer Walsh. Maybe my phone call would have made no difference. Maybe the police would have responded the same way, even if I'd called that night instead of weeks later. But I'll always know that I heard her being killed, and I convinced myself it wasn't my business. That knowledge changes how you see everything else in the world. Every scream you hear, every person who looks scared, every situation that seems slightly off. You wonder if you're missing another chance to save someone's life. The system failed Jennifer in a lot of ways. Her ex-boyfriend violated a restraining order repeatedly without consequences. Police didn't take her concerns seriously until it was too late. And I failed her too, by not trusting my instincts when I heard that scream. She deserved better from all of us. Story number 02. I never thought much about security cameras until I became the person watching them. I got hired as an overnight security monitor at a storage facility about 2 years ago. It seemed like the perfect job for someone like me, quiet. Solitary work that paid decent money for sitting in a small office and keeping an eye on rows of storage units. The facility was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty fields and accessed by a single gravel road. During the day, it was busy with people moving stuff in and out, but at night, it was supposed to be completely empty. The job was straightforward enough. I'd arrive at 11 p.m., check all the locks on the main gates, activate the after-hours security system, and then spend the next 8 hours monitoring feeds from 36 cameras placed throughout the property. Most nights, the most exciting thing I'd see was a raccoon or a stray cat wandering through the motion sensor lights. I brought books, worked on online courses, and basically got paid to sit in a climate-controlled office doing whatever I wanted as long as I glanced at the monitors every few minutes. The storage facility was laid out in a grid pattern with 6 rows of units and 6 units per row. Each row had its own number, and each unit had a letter designation. The cameras were positioned at the end of each row and at several points along the perimeter fence. The video quality wasn't great, especially at night, but it was good enough to see if someone was walking around who shouldn't be there. About 3 months into the job, I started noticing something weird on the monitors. It would happen maybe once a week, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. I'd be reading or working on something else, and when I'd look up at the screens, I'd catch a glimpse of what looked like movement in the shadows between the storage units. At first, I assumed it was animals or maybe just shadows from passing clouds creating the illusion of movement, but the movement seemed too deliberate to be random shadows. It would appear on one camera, then show up on an adjacent camera a few minutes later, like someone was systematically moving through the facility. The problem was that the video quality made it impossible to tell what I was actually seeing. Dark shapes moving between units could have been anything: a person, a large animal, or just my eyes playing tricks on me after staring at grainy monitors for hours. I started keeping a log of when these incidents occurred, thinking maybe I could identify a pattern. Tuesday nights seemed to be the most common, usually around 3 a.m., and it always happened in the same general area, rows C and D, which were toward the back of the facility and farthest from the main office. I'd grab a flashlight and walk out to investigate. But by the time I reached the area where I'd seen movement, there was never any sign of disturbance. No footprints in the gravel, no evidence that anyone had been there. The facility manager, a guy named Dave, worked normal business hours, so I only saw him when I was starting my shift or when he occasionally came in early. I mentioned the movement I'd been seeing on the cameras, and he suggested that it was probably animals or maybe shadows from the highway lights about a mile away. He pointed out that in 2 years of operation, they'd never had a break-in or any serious security incidents. The facility was surrounded by an 8-foot chain link fence with barbed wire on top, and all the units had heavy-duty locks. It would take serious effort and equipment to break into anything. Dave's explanation made sense, and I tried to convince myself that's all it was. But the incidents kept happening, and they were becoming more frequent. Instead of once a week, I was seeing unexplained movement 2 or 3 times per week, always in the same area. I started watching those specific cameras more carefully, and that's when I realized the movement wasn't random at all. Someone was definitely walking through the facility. I could see a dark figure moving deliberately from unit to unit, pausing at certain doors and then moving on. The person seemed to know the layout well and was avoiding the areas with the brightest security lights. They'd appear on one camera for 30 seconds, disappear for 10 minutes, then show up on a different camera closer to the back fence. I started timing my patrol walks to coincide with when I'd see movement on the monitors. If I saw someone on camera at 3 a.m., I'd immediately head out to that area with my flashlight and radio. But I never encountered anyone. It was like whoever was out there could see me coming and knew exactly how to avoid being caught. After 6 weeks of this cat and mouse game, I decided to change my approach. instead of trying to catch the intruder in the act. I'd wait until they left, and then carefully examine the areas where I'd seen them on camera. Maybe they were leaving some trace of their presence that I could use as evidence when I reported it to Dave. The next time I saw movement on the monitors, I stayed in the office and watched carefully. The dark figure moved through rows C and D for about 20 minutes, stopping at several units and appearing to examine the locks. Then they disappeared toward the back fence, and I didn't see them again on any of the perimeter cameras. I waited another hour to make sure they were gone, then went out to investigate. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 units in row D had scratches around the lock mechanisms, like someone had been trying to pick them or force them open. The scratches were fresh. I could see bright metal where tools had scraped against the painted hasps. But none of the locks had been successfully opened, and there was no sign that anything had been stolen. I documented everything with photos and measurements, then called Dave first thing in the morning. He came in immediately and was clearly concerned when he saw the evidence. We checked the customer records for the 3 units that had been tampered with. One belonged to an elderly woman who was storing her late husband's belongings. Another was rented by a young couple who were between apartments. The third was registered to a local business that used it for document storage. Dave contacted all 3 customers to check if anything was missing. The elderly woman's unit was full of furniture, photo albums and boxes of personal items, but she couldn't tell if anything was gone without going through everything piece by piece. The young couple's unit contained mostly clothes and household items, and they said everything looked normal when they checked. The business unit was locked with an additional padlock that showed no signs of tampering, and the owner confirmed that all their documents appeared to be undisturbed. We installed additional cameras in rows C and D and upgraded the motion sensor lights in that area. Dave also changed my patrol schedule, asking me to walk through the facility every hour instead of every 2 hours. For about a month, everything was quiet. No unexplained movement on the cameras, no evidence of anyone trying to break into units. I started to think that maybe the increased security measures had scared off whoever had been prowling around. Then, one Tuesday night in November, it happened again. But this time was different. Instead of just seeing dark shapes moving between units, I could clearly see a person on the monitors. A man, probably middle-aged, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap. He was moving more boldly than before, using a small flashlight and spending longer periods examining the locks on various units. I watched him for about 10 minutes, taking notes on exactly which units he checked and how long he spent at each one. Then I made a decision that probably wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done. Instead of calling the police or waiting for him to leave, I decided to confront him directly. I grabbed my radio, my flashlight, and the heavy-duty maglite that Dave had given me for emergencies. I quietly left the office through the back door and approached row D from the opposite direction, hoping to come up behind him. My plan was to shine the light on him and demand to know what he was doing, while being ready to run if he seemed dangerous. As I crept between the storage units, I could hear faint sounds of metal scraping against metal. He was definitely trying to open locks, and from the sound of it, he was having more success than before. When I reached the end of row D, I could see light from his flashlight moving around inside one of the units. Somehow, he'd managed to get it open. I should have called the police right then. I should have retreated to the office and let professionals handle the situation. Instead, I stepped around the corner and shouted, "Hey, what are you doing in there?" while shining my flashlight directly at the open unit. The man spun around, and for a split second, I got a clear look at his face. He was older than I'd expected, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes. But what I remember most was his expression. He didn't look surprised or scared or guilty. He looked angry, like I was the one who didn't belong there. "This is my unit," he said calmly, not moving from where he stood inside the storage space. I lost my key. I knew he was lying. I'd memorized the customer information for all the units that had been targeted, and this one belonged to the elderly woman storing her husband's belongings. But standing there in the dark, facing someone who was clearly comfortable, breaking into storage units in the middle of the night, I didn't want to argue with him. "I need to see some ID and verify that with the office," I said, trying to sound official and confident. "Can you step out of the unit, please?" That's when I noticed what was scattered on the ground around his feet. Photo albums, loose pictures, and what looked like jewelry boxes. He'd been going through the elderly woman's personal belongings, picking through her memories of her deceased husband. "I don't need to show you anything," he said, and his voice had a menacing edge now. "I pay rent on this unit, and I can access my property whenever I want." I backed up a step and reached for my radio. "I'm calling this in to my supervisor. You can explain the situation to him." The man stepped out of the unit, and I could see that he was bigger than me and carrying what looked like a crowbar. "You're not calling anyone," he said. "You're going to walk back to your little office and forget you saw me here." I turned and ran, not walked, not retreated strategically. I ran as fast as I could back to the office, expecting to hear him chasing after me the whole way. Once I was inside with the door locked, I called 911 and then called Dave. The police arrived within 15 minutes, but by then, the man was gone. The storage unit was still open, with the woman's belongings scattered around, but there was no sign of the intruder. The police took my statement and dusted the unit for fingerprints, but they didn't seem optimistic about catching the guy. Break-ins at storage facilities weren't uncommon, they said, and unless someone was caught in the act or left behind clear evidence, the cases rarely got solved. They suggested that Dave invest in better lighting and maybe hire additional security. The elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, came in the next day to assess what had been taken. It turned out the intruder hadn't stolen anything valuable in terms of money. No jewelry was missing, no electronics or tools, but he'd gone through every photo album and removed specific pictures. Mrs. Patterson couldn't tell me exactly which ones were gone, but she knew photos were missing because loose pictures were scattered around that had clearly been removed from albums. "These were pictures of my husband from before I knew him," she said, sitting in Dave's office looking through the damaged albums. His military service, his first job, pictures with friends from college. Why would someone want those? They're not worth anything to anyone but me. I didn't have an answer for her, but something about the situation bothered me deeply. This wasn't a typical theft. Someone had specifically targeted personal photographs and seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. It felt more like stalking than stealing. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Patterson's stolen photos and the expression on the intruder's face when I'd confronted him. He hadn't looked like someone who'd been caught stealing. He'd looked like someone who'd been interrupted while doing something he felt entitled to do. I started researching Mrs. Patterson online, trying to understand who might want pictures of her late husband. It turns out her husband, Robert Patterson, had been a prominent local businessman who'd served on city council and been involved in various community organizations. He died 3 years ago, and his obituary mentioned surviving family members, including Mrs. Patterson and several adult children. That's when I found something interesting. Robert Patterson had been involved in a lawsuit about 15 years ago. A former business partner named Michael Torres had accused Patterson of stealing clients and trade secrets when Patterson left their shared company to start his own business. The lawsuit had been settled out of court, but according to newspaper reports, it had been contentious and expensive. Michael Torres. I looked up his current address and found that he lived about 10 miles from the storage facility. I also found his driver's license photo on a public records website. It was definitely the same man I'd confronted in Mrs. Patterson's storage unit. I called Dave and explained what I'd discovered. He immediately contacted the police and Mrs. Patterson. It turned out that Torres had been harassing the Patterson family for years, filing frivolous lawsuits and making threatening phone calls. Mrs. Patterson had gotten a restraining order against him 2 years ago, but it was hard to enforce because he was clever about staying just within legal boundaries. The police arrested Torres at his home and found boxes of photographs stolen from Mrs. Patterson's storage unit. He'd also had surveillance equipment and what appeared to be detailed notes about the Patterson family's daily routines. During the investigation, they discovered that Torres had been obsessed with Robert Patterson for over a decade, collecting information about him and his family even after Patterson's death. Torres was charged with burglary, stalking, and violating the restraining order. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years in prison plus probation. Mrs. Patterson got most of her photos back, though some had been damaged or destroyed. The case was resolved, justice was served, and everyone moved on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something much darker than a simple storage unit break-in. Torres had been systematically stalking a dead man's family, stealing pieces of their history and memories. If I hadn't happened to be watching the monitors that night, if I hadn't decided to confront him, he might have continued victimizing Mrs. Patterson indefinitely. What bothers me most is how long Torres had been getting away with it. He'd clearly been visiting the storage facility for months, learning the layout and figuring out which units contained what he wanted. He'd been patient and methodical, planning each break-in carefully. If the cameras had been slightly different angles, if I'd been less attentive, if I'd decided not to investigate the suspicious movement, he might still be out there, terrorizing an elderly widow who just wanted to preserve memories of her late husband. I still work overnight security, though at a different facility now. I pay attention to every shadow, every unexplained movement on the monitors, because I learned that sometimes the person stalking you isn't after money or valuables. Sometimes they're after something much more personal and disturbing. They want pieces of your life, your history, your identity. and they're willing to be very patient to get it. Mrs. Patterson moved her husband's belongings to a different storage facility after the break-in. She said she couldn't stand the thought of keeping them somewhere that Torres had contaminated. I don't blame her. Some violations feel permanent, like they change the meaning of everything they touch. Even when the perpetrator is caught and punished, the damage to your sense of safety and privacy can last forever.